Hi, everyone who's joining us. Just going to give it a few seconds as attendees roll in. Wow, fantastic group today. Hi, everyone who's just joining us. Just a couple more seconds as attendees roll in, and then we will begin. Okay, it is 1:01 Eastern, so we're going to get started. Welcome to today's ASEE webinar, Demystifying Continuous Improvement in Program Assessment. This webinar is sponsored by ABET. My name is Alexandra Sharp, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. You can connect with us with the Q&A pod. And after the webinar, please complete our survey and access webinar materials, which we will be sending via email within 2 business days. If you have questions throughout the webinar, you can use the Q&A pod at any time, or you can wait to submit your questions at the end of the webinar, where we will have dedicated time for Q&A. Today's speaker is Jenny Amos. Jenny is a teaching professor in bioengineering at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is an AIMBE fellow, BMES Board of Director member, ABET commissioner, 2-time Fulbright specialist in engineering education, and has won multiple awards and recognitions for her teaching and scholarship of teaching. Outside of BME, she has also worked to revolutionize the future of graduate medical education, serving as a founding member of the new Carle, Illinois College of Medicine, a first-of-its-kind engineering-driven College of Medicine. At Carle, Illinois, Amos served as the founding director of Student Assessment and Quality Officer. Amos is part of the Illinois NSF RED, Revolutionizing Engineering and Computer Science Department's research team, leading efforts to innovate assessment practices for engineering toward producing more holistic engineers. Amos has a decade's worth of experience leading curriculum reform, implementing robust assessment strategies at multiple institutions. And with that, I will let Jenny take it away. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Alex. Appreciate being able to talk today to share some of my tips and experiences on Criterion 4, and also thank you all for attending today. So again, what we wanted to talk about in coordination with ABET to the ASEE audience was what seems to be a sticking point for a lot of programs is the continuous improvement, otherwise known as Criterion 4. There are a lot of questions about this particular criteria and perhaps some misconceptions that we're hoping to clear up today. So a couple weeks ago, when there were only 720 registrants for this audience today, we ran some stats on those questions we asked during registration to figure out who was attending this webinar. And so the vast majority of attendees were from the engineering programs or engineering community. But we do have representation from multiple different what we call commissions in ABET, so computing, natural sciences, or engineering technology. And some people are here on behalf of multiple types of programs, which is very exciting as well. We also asked what was your level of expertise with both accreditation and assessment. And you can see here that most people selected the intermediate, so familiarity, but maybe still some kind of tips and tricks to learn about both assessment and accreditation. Very few people noted themselves as experts. And I would say, I'm not even sure that I am. I'm not sure that anyone can really be expert because the whole point of being involved in a continuous improvement process is to continually learn and improve your own knowledge and your own implementation. And so, you know, in order to achieve that, I think we've all got to feel a little bit of reserve about, you know, our own skill in those areas. So it was really helpful to me to understand more about our audience today. So I do have a poll that I want to launch right now, which is, why are you doing student outcomes assessment in your program? So hopefully that poll will pop up for you now, and we'll see some of the results onto, why are you involved in program assessment? And you can select multiple answers. So I know there may not be one best answer here. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of participation. So 85% of people as of right then, already up to 88. 83% said for certification by ABET or another accreditation agency. So kind of thinking about compliance. 78% is the second highest category here, where we can improve our program. 60% are to learn more about our students' learning, and 4% are here for their own personal fame, my favorite. So obviously I put that one in here just as a joke, but it also is really helpful if you are recognized for your work in assessment in order to continue to keep motivated in terms of how you're doing and keeping engaged in that continuous improvement process. So one of my goals for today is to get you to think about your own motivation for doing program assessment. And so I really love this quote. This comes from the Wiggins Education Assessment resource at the bottom of the screen. And the quote is, "The aim of assessment should be to educate and improve student performance, not merely to audit it." And so I think a lot of times when we think of continuous improvement processes for ABET, we think that we're doing it for the purpose of compliance. And certainly that is part of why we're doing continuous improvement processes the way we are. But if we can shift our thinking more towards thinking about how we can improve our programs and really focusing the impact and the measurements on student learning, I think that we can find new motivations and new reasons to engage in the continuous improvement process. And so assessment is definitely part of that continuous improvement process. And I mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about Criterion 4. And so Criterion 4 is the continuous improvement criteria. If you're not familiar with it, it is up here on the screen, but I want to highlight a few parts at a time. And so we're going to start with the very first sentence of the criterion, which says that a program needs to use appropriate documented processes for assessing, the students in the program, let's say for now. And so this is really part of our motivation, is that we have to come up with some process to assess our students and then, generate this body of evidence and use it to make decisions, which leads me to educational literature. And so many in the engineering education community will talk about this assessment triangle. The assessment triangle is a framework. It comes from the Knowing What Students Know publication, where a triangle has 3 vertices. The first is cognition, and cognition is how we form a model about what a student knows and is learning based on the domain of an assessment. And so we're going to dive into cognition first. Then we're going to talk about observation, which is how we're going to gather that evidence, right? How can we show evidence that a student is achieving competencies, right? They are demonstrating learning, and we're going to measure that. The next step is the interpretation step. So this is the process we use for making sense of the data, for using the data to improve student learning and cognition. And so, of course, this is a cycle. And so our assessment processes and our continuous improvement are going to take us through this cycle. And I'll be coming back to this diagram several times throughout the talk today, and highlighting in each section that we're talking about in orange until we've completed the whole cycle. So we're going to start with cognition. And again, cognition is this idea of how we can model student learning in a way that allows us to measure it. So we are trying to make the learning measurable. And for this section, you might ask some questions. Well, how do I know what my students are learning? And how can I design assessments to measure that learning? It's important to think about what is cognition. So cognition, again, is a set of assumptions about how students may represent knowledge. So it may be developing competence in a particular domain and knowledge that builds over time, or it may be an application of knowledge that's not being taught in the moment, but something they're pulling from a personal experience or a previous course. Either way, kind of the central premise is that we need to find ways that all of our learners represent their knowledge, but keeping in mind that knowledge is personal, it's interpersonal, it's social, it's environmental. And so we have to kind of coach students in the right way to demonstrate the knowledge we're trying to really see and feel. And that really leads us to the field of assessment. So if a student is going through a learning experience and we want to be able to measure it, we need to think about how a student might represent that knowledge, and then, of course, how we can measure it. And typically this is done in program assessment at the classroom level, right? In assignments that we do in a class, but it may also be done out of class. Maybe if a required co-op or something is happening, we can pull student learning out of those as well. And so again, learning theory tells us that there are a few different frameworks we can pull from to measure these mental processes of cognition. There are a few examples up here on the board. I'll just highlight two of them. You may be familiar with the kind of the idea that knowledge is conceptual. Knowledge is, some say, constructed, or use a constructivist view where knowledge builds over time. And again, that it's kind of complex and it builds. And also we have this framework that's very commonly used in item 3, which is called Bloom's taxonomy. And taxonomy is a list of words, terms that we can use to describe and kind of classify learning and demonstrations of learning in a particular learning experience. And so Bloom's has a few domains, and the one that we're going to talk about today is the cognitive domain. And I'll show you an example of that. But this is going to allow us to take that student learning and make it more tacit, make it more measurable in the classroom, in the moment, so that we can track it over time. And I really like this example here about assessment. So assessment is more than just knowing what a student can do or how a student performs on a particular assignment. Really, it's about getting into the student's head and seeing what that learning looks like. And of course, it's complex. We can't measure it. The student brain doesn't grow as they accumulate knowledge. We also can't use our medical imaging technologies and put them in an MRI scanner and look at activity in the brain. That doesn't tell us about the student learning. So what we have to do is find ways to prompt students to demonstrate that behavior so that we can observe it and then measure and document it. And the tendency in assessment is to look at, I guess, a loose description of a learning experience, maybe through design of a task or a problem. And so in our context here, what we want to do is try to get them to demonstrate skills that are relevant to the engineering or computing or technology professions. And so a lot of us will rely on the ABET student outcomes to tell us generally what those are. And then also, of course, for the purpose of, compliance and accreditation, these are ones that we know we need to meet. So it's a happy medium where these are skills and knowledge and abilities that our field wants us to see students demonstrate. And for accreditation purposes, these are the ones that we need to demonstrate. So I've picked two here just as examples. One is from the Engineering Commission, or EAC, and one is from computing. And let's just take a look at some of these terms. So we have the student outcome, and it's asking us to develop something, but also to conduct appropriate experimentation, also to analyze and to interpret, and then finally to use engineering judgment to draw conclusions. So it's more complicated than just asking a student to summarize some knowledge, right? We're in an kind of a different domain of learning, which is where this Bloom's taxonomy is going to come in and help us break this down into what is it that we really want to see a student do? How would a student demonstrate that they can do each of these very different skills, abilities, tasks, if you will, within this student outcome? Similarly, in our computing outcome, we're asking students here to design, to implement, and to evaluate this computing solution, and to do it within the context of a computing requirement or set of context that is provided. And so again, students may be able to do some of these skills earlier in the curriculum, some later in the curriculum, and we want to make sure that we are measuring or adequately getting an idea of how students are learning these things so that they can attain them by the time of graduation. So here on the left side of the screen, we have a simple version of Bloom's taxonomy. You can see we have evaluation at the top. This is considered to be the highest level skill of, kind of this creation and evaluating something against a set of criteria. Is very complicated, complex problem solving. We also have synthesis, right? So bringing things from different contexts together to make a whole. We have analysis, so dealing with lots of data, making decisions based on those data. Applications is how we demonstrate, sometimes in a practical sense, a particular skill, but it can also just be applying knowledge from one domain to another. So for instance, applying math when solving an engineering problem. And then we have comprehension and knowledge. These are considered to be kind of lower level tasks where a student may categorize, identify, explain some basic concepts that are kind of underlying the principles at hand. And so we want to make sure that students have a constructed experience, meaning that maybe in one course they're learning the material, in another course they might be applying it, and then finally they have an opportunity to engage at the high level in terms of synthesis and evaluation. And so if I take that same computing outcome and I want to break it down into parts that I can see in my curriculum, I provide here just one example of a way you can do that. So first, a student might identify constraints, and maybe it's not during the design course, maybe it's early in their curriculum that they can do that because that's a lower level skill. So can you identify constraints for a design problem? Now, maybe I'm going to ask them to actually carry out a solution and to justify their approach based on some constraints. Well, that's an application. And so that's a different skill than identifying, right? So I want to make sure that I look at both of those because I need them to design and implement. Now, maybe I want to ask that they look at all the possible solutions before they come to the one final design that they implement. That's analysis. That's being able to look at kind of the whole picture and make a decision based on some data. Of course, if I'm asking them to implement it, that is another application. And then if I ask them to evaluate it, That is, of course, evaluation, which is our top level. So you can see here that I took one student outcome and I broke it into, I guess you could call these sub outcomes. They're also often called performance indicators. These are ways that we break that big outcome down and to make it more measurable or meaningful at kind of the course and assignment level, so that we can measure it and then use that measurement to infer whether or not we have met the overall outcome. So what does this look like in the classroom, in practice? This is just a very simple example here of a very basic mechanics example. So we have a ball and a spring. The ball is going to fall from a certain height and land on the spring and produce an effect. And so in a very simple problem like this with a ball and spring, we could ask ourselves, what learning skills are important here? Why are these important? And how can I ask students to target these skills when they're working on a problem, maybe within a course or within a problem set? And then, how can I assess that and measure that particular performance? And then you might also ask yourself, what are some other skills? Are there any missed opportunities here? So going through an exercise like that for a very simple problem, I came up with some basics that I might want to use as an assessment. So first, there's an outcome, a student learning outcome that focuses on solving complex problems. I could make this into a complex problem and measure my students' ability to solve a complex problem. Conversely, I could turn this into an open-ended design problem and have them approach it like that. I could also ask students to go do some research about different materials for springs and kind of pull information into a system, and I could measure their ability to acquire new knowledge. Maybe I'm going to ask the students to do this in a team setting, then I could assess teamwork. And so one simple problem in maybe a basic course here, and I can actually assess a lot of different skills and cognitive abilities of my students, while just changing the way that maybe I ask a question or changing how I measure what they submit as evidence. So to make this really concrete, let's look at what I would ask. Here we have the same spring and ball system, and I've added a problem prompt to the top of it. So this one is going to look at my complex problem solving abilities. So now I have framed the same ball and spring as I have a block of mass 2 kilos dropping from a height onto a spring that has a known spring constant. And I want my students to find the distance that that spring is going to be compressed. So here I have outcome 1, which is an ability from ASEE, which is an ability to formulate and solve complex engineering problems. I can break that down into my performance criteria, and I've just listed 2 here from my program. So we can apply conservation of mass and energy and relate that back into bioengineering problems. I can also have them apply differential equations and look at their ability to do that. So this is a rubric that I might use where I might say I have 3 levels of performance that I want to figure out where my students are. Are they developing, where they're kind of just struggling with the basic concepts, not able to formulate the terms or solve a differential equation? Can they write the equation and compute the terms correctly? Similarly, can they solve that differential equation if it's given to them? And then also in my advanced case here, now I have them, really writing out the basic equation and maybe deriving their equation and computing the terms correctly. Similarly, they can give an approximate solution without reference materials for a differential equation. And so if I'm grading this ball and spring problem, I can look for each individual performance criteria and decide where on my rubric the particular student is going to score. So instead of just looking at the overall score of did the student get the question right, I can break that out and say, well, they had advanced skill in that they derived the equation and they solved everything correctly. But they really referred to a table of solutions in order to get that differential equation done. And so I'm able to tease out maybe some differences in how students are performing and attaining my overall outcome just based on one simple spring problem. As another example in design, I take my same spring problem, but now I'm going to frame it as a design situation. So now I'm asking students to design a spring using a material of their choosing, such that the block can be dropped from the height and the spring does not exceed compression of 10 centimeters. So I've constrained the problem a little bit too. So here, just as an example for design, I can have students look at outcome 2, which is to apply engineering to design to produce solutions that meet a specified need. Again, I can look on my rubric and say, where on this sliding scale do they fall? Did they look at alternatives? Did they kind of analyze some alternatives? Or did they really go all the way and analyze the alternatives, give pros and cons, and really defend why they chose their final solution? So again, very simple spring and block problem, but I'm able to get a lot of information about how my students are attaining outcomes in this one simple example, just by phrasing the question to get the student to demonstrate the evidence the way that I want to collect it. And so, you can see here where if you change the way you ask a question, your student may give you a very different response. And so that's why it's important to think about the design of the assessment to get the response that you do want. So now we're going to move into observation. And so again, this is how we get that evidence out. So we just talked about how you can kind of ask questions and measure, but now we want to know, how do I assess them? Where in my curriculum do I assess them, and when? So there's 2 main types of measures I'm going to talk about today, and those are direct and indirect. Direct measures are really allowing the student to directly show you their skill and ability and allow the instructor to observe that skill or ability. So it's really seeing the student in a natural habitat, demonstrating that skill, knowledge, behavior. Indirect measures are more of a self-assessment. So asking a student about their ability to do something or their opinion of a particular experience. Both are valid measures, but they're going to have very kind of different purposes and ways that we do them. So I would say direct measures are what we commonly see used as evidence for a lot of our outcome attainment. And so these are things, again, that you're measuring in your class. So tests and quiz questions. Notice it doesn't say the whole test or the whole quiz, just questions from them, because again, the individual question is where the student's demonstrating the learning. And we'll talk later about what grades mean versus assessment. Project reports, presentations, lab practicals, all of the things that happen in class where we're really focused on the student learning. In terms of indirect, of course, questions that we may ask students on questionnaires, anecdotal information. So if there's a discussion about how students are performing in general at a faculty meeting, that can be very helpful for your assessment process, but it's not direct. It may be based on some evidence. And then student feedback from those course evaluations. And you'll see here that the written questions and surveys is actually in both category. And again, that gets back to the idea that it's how you ask the question that produces the evidence. And so I can ask a question in which a student self-assesses where they think they're at in terms of their learning, or they may demonstrate their learning. There's also, who you're asking the question to, which can be part of direct or indirect. If I'm asking students to peer assess each other, that can be a direct assessment because those students were part of the team and observed that person's teamwork. Whereas if I ask a student their own assessment of their teamwork, that would be indirect. And so in my personal program, we use a lot of different digital learning tools. And I'll say that's been one good outcome of all of this e-learning, hybrid learning, high flex, online programs that we've been dealing with lately is that a lot of us have become more proficient at using digital tools for grading and for our learning management systems. And again, I'll mention ABET does not endorse any particular platform for data collection or representation of data, but there's also no rule that you can't use a digital form if it's something that's going to help you be more sustainable in your collection of data. And so I've given some examples here again, just ones that we use at my institution at Illinois. So we sometimes use portfolios, and there are some systems that allow you to pull information out of portfolio systems for the purpose of coursework. We have a computer-based testing facility that runs a lot of our quizzes and exams and homeworks or in-class activities. We can pull student performance data from there. We use a system called GradeScope. I think there's a very similar system called CrowdMark, just something to help us with our grading of student work. And then of course we can pull reports from there. SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics for your surveys. You may use Macmillan or McGraw-Hill, put out particular resources if you're using their like textbooks. You can take quizzes online and have your students send in those reports. And then of course, Blackboard or Canvas or whatever learning management system you have can help you keep track of student learning data. And so for this, one great thing for our program has been the variety of platforms that, all of our faculty are able to choose what works best for them. And then if we identify a question, like our spring question earlier, that's in one of their assessments, it's fairly easy for the faculty to download that assessment report and tell us how many students reach each of the levels and then send that back to the program. So that makes the data collection process just a little bit easier in terms of managing all of that data coming back and putting it together in the program. And so again, going back to Criterion 4, the Criterion states that we need to regularly use a process to evaluate the extent to where outcomes are being attained. And so what does it mean to be regular? Well, I think that's going to vary a lot based on your context. So we know the main steps of the process are going to be the same, but the frequency and period with which it repeats will be different for each program. So I'll walk you through the steps of the cycle and then show you a few examples that I've seen for how programs decide when to do this assessment work. So of course, we know we need to collect assessment data. We know we need to evaluate the data, meaning use it to make decisions. And those decisions are going to turn into an action plan, something that faculty can take back and actually implement in their courses. And then we know that this is going to repeat over and over and over again. So we're going to collect data, we're going to make a decision, have that action plan. We may not do everything that's, in our kind of total list, but we're going to strategically pick a few things to do and then implement it. And we're going to repeat it again and again so that we can assess the impact of those changes. So, people ask all the time, what's the right length of cycle? Should it be a 1-year cycle, a 2-year cycle, a 3-year cycle? Well, of course, there's not one right answer. It's all dependent upon what your program needs and what's sustainable for you. So here's a couple of examples. Here in this first example, you can see a 4-year program. The first year, maybe they haven't done assessment or they're developing an action plan based on last year's data. Maybe they're going to take a year and really make a detailed plan. Then they're going to put that into action and develop new course materials or, try a different pedagogical approach, whatever the action plan may be. The next year, they might come back and assess. And then the following year, they might, maybe they're going to collect data fall, spring, look at it in the summer, but really they're not going to come up with that action plan again until everyone's back on campus in the fall that following year. Then they can put that plan into place again and assess the next year. So here you can see that there's kind of a year of evaluate action plan, and then every other year they are doing assessment of student outcomes. So this would be a fine cycle if this is something that worked for your program, to spend a whole year, evaluating and planning and implementing changes, and then coming back and assessing. Here you can see a 2-year program. This one, they have their plan, they're implementing, putting into place. They're going to do their assessment, evaluation, and action all in 1 year. So let's say maybe they didn't hit some of their targets. They want to get that change made so that they can hit it the next year. And so then they would assess again in year 2. So this is an example of more of an annual cycle where they are going to assess in a 2-year program those students twice, at the end of year 1 and at the end of year 2. As another example, here you see a program who puts their plan into place, and now they're going to do what we just saw that 2-year program do. They're going to do all the steps: assess, evaluate, and take action every year. Now, I've heard some arguments that this is the preferred method because it just gets your faculty into a rhythm, right? They're always doing some assessment. They're always talking about the data and making some decisions. And that's great if that works for you and your program, but it may not. And then here we have a 2-year program. This is a little more spread out. So in this one, they plan, they assess at the end. So they are assessing the graduating students and then put into plan and assess the graduating students again. So all of this is to say that there's not a one size fits all, a one cycle fits all. It's dependent upon your resources, your faculty time. It may even be dependent on how many students are in your program. If you have a really small program, you may want to wait until you have enough data to really make an informed decision, or to get all the students through that phase to look at the cohort all together. So, it really depends on what works for your program. But what is important is that you assess the students by the time of graduation. So the goal is to produce students who have achieved the competencies or the outcomes to the best of their abilities by the time of graduation, which is what's stated in Criterion 3. So the Criterion 3 says that we have to have these outcomes attained in order to prepare graduates for the profession of engineering. So if we want to assess throughout a program in order to ensure that we meet, what we might do is, instead of thinking about doing everything in every year, in every course, we might split it up. So we can spread assessments out over many courses within a program. And so here you can see there's a few different colors which have some meaning. So the first is the green here, which says introduce. So it's green and I. The orange here with the R is reinforce. So if a skill is introduced, that might mean students are hearing it for the first time. Students are only doing maybe a low Bloom's level of, defining, categorizing, explaining. It may mean many things in your program. In reinforce, it may mean that students are advancing. They're now applying it in context. But it may not be the best place to get a true measure of if the student is meeting the outcome. So you might wait until the mastery phase, which is when we would expect the students really to have that skill, that knowledge to the best of their ability. And that could be a good time to take a measure. And so you can see here that if we work off the definition of by the time of graduation, we might end up doing a lot in our course 400. And so many of you who teach in engineering or computing programs might guess this is probably our capstone or design course. That's where we tend to assess a lot of these different skills, knowledge, and abilities, where they're being demonstrated during a complex problem. But there are additional opportunities to assess. So we could assess parts of student outcome 1 in course 350. We could get part of student outcome 2 in course 350. We could look at course 300 for part of student outcome 3. Additionally, we could do what's called formative assessment. We could take a little peek at how students are doing in any of these orange R courses. and try to see if we're already meeting our targets early on in the program, or if we need to do something and wait and measure later on. So there's lots of different ways that you can spread out the different assessment approaches so that you're being inclusive of faculty. You're really being true to what we say in cognition, which is that knowledge is formed over time. And also just for sustainability, your design instructor has a lot of assessments that we know they're going to be doing because it's a design course. And so if you can take some of those other skills that are easily assessed in other courses out of that particular bucket, that's going to be helpful too, so that other faculty also are participating more in the assessment process. So there's many reasons why you might want to think about spreading out the assessment across many courses in a program. So the last vertice of our triangle is interpretation, which is how do we make sense of data that we've collected? And so for this, you might ask questions like, why can't I just use grades? Why can't I just average things together? And how do I set these benchmarks or targets that she keeps talking about? So these are great questions, and we're going to try to dive into some of those briefly. So the first one is about course grades. I would say this is probably the number one question that comes up in assessment workshops and, and people who are just starting at assessment is, why can't I just use the course grades? So course grades are really an aggregated set of experiences that lead towards a grade. So if a student gets 10% off on an assignment because it's late, does that mean that they really didn't understand it as well? Are we really measuring their cognitive ability? No, I think we would all agree that, that late penalty tells us something about maybe the student or their circumstances, but it doesn't tell us about their cognitive ability. The other thing is that grades are not diagnostic. Grades are a combination of a lot of different factors. And so we don't want to rely on those for those measurements of cognition. It's a little too holistic and not quite analytical or broken down enough that we can get to the heart of what we're trying to learn. Another question we get a lot is about averaging. Can I average all the results when I get them back? This can hide some really nuanced understanding about your students in your program. So in this graph, we have a number of students, so it's a histogram versus their test score. And you can see we have two distinct populations, students who have done really, really well and students who have done poorly. If we average those together, we might come away with an understanding that all of our students are kind of right here in the middle, but that's not really representative of what's happening. And so we want to think about ways that we can represent what it is we're trying to do with the most kind of tie to what's happening with the student learning, not just what is in the data. Another example of aggregation and where it really hurts us is in this table where we're looking at combining scores. So if I take student data from a few different assignments within these courses and add up how many students I have and how many students met my goal, I might say, I met my goal. I have 70% of my students meeting attainment. But really, if we look at each individual assignment, we can see that this one here in the middle did not meet that standard benchmark. They're actually really far below the benchmark. And so you don't want to conceal things like that, because what we want to do is celebrate that we had 90 and 80% of students meeting a goal for performance in these two courses, widgets 1 and 3. But we want to really pay attention to what's happening in this course. And the answer isn't that it's a bad course or something went wrong. It may be that the question that was chosen just wasn't good for what we were trying to assess. It may be as simple as that, and that's a very fixable problem that we can deal with during our continuous improvement process. So the last thing I want to leave you with is what to do with the results. So we said we have to use these to make decisions. We need to have a documented process. So all of this means we need results. And we also talked about how we should be motivated by student learning and action, not just the kind of the audit process. And so if you're showing tables like this, it's great because you have, this broken down information. So here's from earlier, this conservation and differential equations. We have it broken into categories. But what does it mean, right? How are we using this to improve our program? Well, what we want to get to is having an action plan. And so for us, this means taking these data to our faculty, discussing them in a meeting, and trying to make a decision. And you can see here, zooming in on the action item, that maybe the decision isn't to change anything about the course. The decision in this particular case was to add some supplemental lectures and a pretest that would tell students if maybe they would benefit from some additional study or materials in differential equations. So, again, just because you identify something as a problem doesn't mean you need to go back and change your whole curriculum. It just means you need to take some action to make sure that students who are not meeting have an opportunity to meet that particular outcome. And I think that's really where continuous improvement shines, is in helping you to identify things that maybe aren't surface level and maybe aren't obvious, and make sure that they get, dealt with so that students can achieve the outcomes. So as I mentioned earlier, we filled in these bubbles as we went. We covered the 3 vertices of the triangle. I also want to leave you with some resources that will be sent to you right after the webinar. So there's 2 tools. One is a self-assessment tool that ABET provides on their webpage. And it helps you just to think about what are the best practices in assessment, in evaluation, and in breaking down my student outcomes, and where am I in that process, so that I can kind of measure my program against those best practices. So again, you'll get a PDF of this along with the recording just after the webinar. And there's a second handout. This was actually made by the Accreditation Council for the purpose of training. And so several commissioners, including myself, authored this document, and it was endorsed by the Accreditation Council to be shared. It's a 1-page front and back summary of Criterion 4 best practices. And I'd like to also fill in this orange bubble, because hopefully today you have taken away some more motivation of how to focus on the student learning and less on the audit side of continuous improvement. If you have enjoyed this talk today, or you want to learn more, I would love to point you to ABET's website to look at upcoming programming. So there's lots of workshops, there's lots of resources and tools you can download that are free. So always something you can do. And then you can access these on-demand webinars as well through the ABET webpage. So as promised, I have left some time for questions, and I would be delighted to take questions from the audience. I can see that we've had several pop up. So I will ask if some of those can be directed to me, and I'll answer as many as I can.
All right. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, Jenny. So we do have a lot of questions, and I'm going to go in the order that they were received. So my apologies if you've already answered them. I am not an assessment expert. So the first question is, how can we define the level of complexity of a problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the Engineering Accreditation Commission, which uses that term complex problems, there is an ABET provided definition of what they mean by complex. And really what complex means in this context is combining skills from maybe different areas or domains. And there's some really good examples, again, on the ABET webpage that I think will be helpful for determining whether or not something meets that complex definition.
Thank you, Jenny. Next question is, do you consider peer assessment of work or of teamwork to be direct or indirect assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say we get that one a lot. So we do a 360 evaluation in several of our courses. And so when a student is peer evaluating, again, on a standard or on a rubric, a peer who was part of their team, that's a direct assessment because they are directly assessing based on observation a peer in that group setting. When they assess their own ability to behave in a team, that's an indirect assessment. So when you do kind of a 360, that usually includes a peer and a self. And so that would be combining to some degree the indirect and direct assessment.
So FE exam scores, would that be a direct or an indirect?
That would be a direct. Yeah, FE is a great example. Thank you for that question. It's also great because it is standardized across, the whole discipline and serves as a really good benchmark for performance. So FE is direct. Very good example.
Thank you. Well, don't thank me. Thank the person who asked the question. Could you please speak to the amount of data collected and the appropriate amount necessary for effective assessment?
Oh, that is a whale of a question. I'm not going to be able to directly answer it, but what I will say is as long as your data is enough that you feel confident you can make some decisions or at least start to pick apart a decision, then it's enough. So what we do in our program is we'll collect our data and, we have some that we collect every year. And sometimes we'll do like what we call like a special collection, which is part of our action plan. And we don't want to go crazy, but we just want enough that we can make an informed decision. And so if your data is strong enough that you can say you can make an informed decision on something, then it's enough, and there's really not much else I can tell you other than if your data is providing you information, then it probably is doing its purpose. And so that would be a good assessment process.
Great, thank you. Next question. Does ABET expect to see formative assessment of each SO?
Oh, no, ABET does not have any requirements for formative assessment. They do typically tend to encourage the most direct possible and a blend or multiple assessments for your outcomes, but there is no requirement for formative. So formative is great to do, a sneak peek or a check or to monitor long-term, but it is not a requirement. It is simply a best practice.
Thank you.
Some sirens outside.
Going back to direct versus indirect, employer surveys, direct or indirect?
That is a sticky topic. So if you have a required co-op and you are able to survey all of your employers about students, and you have, proper privacy in place to protect those, that would be a direct assessment. If you are having students voluntarily do maybe an internship and it's not for all your students, I would consider it anecdotal and say that it's indirect. So I think it just depends on if everyone is getting that assessment as part of a required experience, so meaning it's an equity kind of an access issue, or if it's a one-off, then it would be indirect.
Great. Next question. How do you do assessment without overburdening faculty with data collection and analysis of data, etc.? Faculty are already overloaded with teaching and research. So what are best practices for a good CIP that meets the goals?
This is a $10 million question. So I would say in my program, I'm at a very research intensive university. And of course, there are many of us in leadership positions in addition to being research intensive faculty. So it's a very kind of palpable type of conversation when we're talking about assessment. And what we have done is very carefully constructed a plan that spreads out assessment such that each course in our core curriculum only is in charge of assessing, let's say, a few indicators, and they send that data back, and then we have a staff member who helps to kind of collate it together. So I think the more you can spread out and share in the assessment collection, then the less each individual is going to do. With that said, design or capstone is always going to have a little bit more of that burden. And so we make sure that that faculty member has, some resources so that they can get help collecting the data that's needed from those reports.
Thank you. Okay. I have just a question from an anonymous attendee. How can one ask questions? They don't see the questions that are being asked. So I got your question, so you can just send them into the Q&A pod. The attendees don't see the questions, but we see the questions, the panelists and the host. Thank you. Next question is, what are best practices if a program meets their set targets for each of their student outcomes performance criteria?
First of all, celebrate. That's a great achievement. I don't think that we've achieved that yet. But I would say, the purpose of continuous improvement is to figure out how to meet your goals. And once you've met your goals, is to figure out how to set new ones. So how can you continue to challenge yourself? How can you continue to make sure that your students are achieving goals? Maybe set different goals. So if your outcomes are being achieved kind of overall, but maybe you still have some sub outcomes or indicators that aren't as strong, maybe just focusing in on those and seeing how you can make those better while still maintaining the others. So just, I think, reframing your goals, challenging yourself in new ways would be my answer to that.
Great. Thank you. Just 1 second. Okay, next question is, do we need to assess all performance indicators at a time for a specific outcome?
No, that's also a great question. You can definitely spread them out. In our program, we are the model I showed first, where we assess every other year, and we do all indicators just a stone's throw away, one building away. They split up their indicators and do them over a 2-year period. And so again, it's just part of that, being respectful of faculty and time and finding something that's sustainable. If spreading them out helps you stay on top of it and get the data you need, spread them out. That's perfectly fine.
Great, thank you so much. 1 second. So many questions. Okay. All right, you provide great information. This is part of the question, with tips that make the process much easier than some make it to be. Unfortunately, convincing a large department to create an ABET better process, as you described, is very hard. Any tips?
I agree. So I would say I'm in the bioengineering department here. We're a new program. And so when I was first hired, we hadn't been through our first cycle. We created everything from scratch. And so because of that, I think we created a really strong process and we were all bought into it. We were a really small department. After that first accreditation cycle, I was asked to go over to another department here that is very large and has been around for a very long time, and to help them redo their process. I hear you. It was hard. It was like pushing an elephant through a tiny door. But I think because I was focusing them not on this is ABET and we have to do it and this is the process, but focusing on, what questions do you have about your curriculum? What do you hear from employers that you might want to work on? How can we ask those questions during this process so that the information you get is helpful? And those led to some very fruitful conversations about what are we collecting and what is the purpose of it, and by telling them, well, you're collecting this for your program and to satisfy your employers, that really changed their thinking. And it wasn't so much we're doing this for ABET anymore. It was we're doing this for us. And so our engineers, are better when they enter the workforce. And I think that, again, that reframing really did help with getting them moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to see if we can squeeze in 2 more questions. So
okay.
The first one, based on some ABET work we saw, we decided to switch to assessing each outcome on a 3-year cycle. This will give us time to review and revise our instruments. Is this okay? All outcomes will be assessed twice in a review cycle, but not every year.
Yeah, that seems to still meet the criteria that it's regular, it's planned, you're monitoring it. And so, we want to make sure our students meet before graduation as much as possible. So I would just say, think about ways that you can be agile. If you have a student cohort that you just measured in your year 3 that is about to graduate, is there anything you need to do to jump in and make sure that they attain those goals? If you're generally meeting your outcomes, there's probably not a need to assess more frequently if that process has been working for you. So I think it still meets the intention and the wording of the criteria to do that 3-year cycle.
Okay, 2 quick ones. Do all courses in a program need to be assessed for the outcomes?
That is a quick question. The answer is no. Now I'll give some context. So no, not everything has to be assessed. What you need is the courses that everyone takes. So like your core courses, you need to make sure that those do. If you can do a smattering of electives, that would be helpful as well. But you need to at least hit all the courses that your students take, that are required.
Okay, last question. Do we have to have performance indicators?
You do not have to have performance indicators. And I'll say the reason you hear performance indicators a lot is because that's how we make the outcomes measurable. So you need to be able to show to ABET that if you're not using performance indicators, that you have a way of converting those kind of broad, vague statements into something that you are measuring in your programs, in your classes. If you can do that without performance indicators, that is absolutely fine, but you need to show the steps in between where the assignment is and how it gets up to that broad outcome. And that's usually why you see people use a performance indicator.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny. We are over time. We still have 367 attendees listening to these Q&A. I would like to say thank you so much to Jenny for this fantastic presentation. Thank you to ABET for making this webinar possible today. And as a reminder, we will be sending out all of the materials to everyone who registered via email. And those materials include a survey, which we would love you to complete, the slides, the recording, and the supplementary handouts that Jenny mentioned during today's webinar. So thank you everybody so much for attending, and we will let you have the rest of your day. Thanks everyone.